I am working in the climate space, but I come from humanitarian and disaster risk reduction community, and that's what made me realize that unless we tackle climate change, we'll not be able to deal with the disaster, and somehow our efforts on the disaster risk reduction side or resilience building were not being sufficient because of the increasing risks that climate change was posing. And we all are aware 90% of disasters that we are facing are weather related. And on top of it, when you have slow onset events, this is something that the whole world is not prepared to deal with yet. So that's the context. And we also know when the adaptation concept was being developed, the adaptation, as a concept, if I can take the liberty of saying, has come more from the top, more from the environmental community, whereas the grassroots experience has come from the humanitarian and disaster risk reduction community. Now, these experiences had to come together, and adaptation does bring a lot of scientific rigor that DRR community was kind of missing, because we were relying much more on our past experiences, on conventional risks, and we were doing things on ground and influencing policies. Whereas adaptation brings a new set of science as well as inputs and new disciplines coming together. And even now, when we look at where things are, I think the silos continue to remain largely where they were. Yes, conceptually, we do find many tools that have been developed on how to bring these concepts together, particularly at the conceptual level, I would say, but not at the grassroots level, because this session is talking about locally led adaptation. I still see that divide, not only at the practitioners level, but also at the policy level. What we see even in countries like Bangladesh, where we have seen disaster management bodies and environmental communities coming together, yet we face those challenges where we don't see all the extreme weather events and slow onset events as part of the same spectrum, when we know a lot of experience can be exchanged between the two communities, and between the experiences of dealing with extreme weather events and slow onset disasters. But that challenge remains. So I think that's the first bit that we have to recognize. Now, how we can actually overcome that. Aga, you were talking about the IPCC Working Group 2 report. One very important thing that we need to understand, this report has analyzed 127 risks. And that, to me, is something that we need to be considering in our approaches as well, how we put risk at the center. And at the very local level, we should forget about which community we belong to. And this is where it can become a starting point for us to look at what kind of conventional risks communities face, what are the new risks that science tells us, which we are currently facing, and in future that are going to be a lot more critical. For example, glacier melt, increasing pace of desertification, sea level rise, ocean acidification. Some of these risks that I'm talking about, which DRR community does not refer to very often. And only recently, in fact, speaking of India, I was reading the National Disaster Management Policy published in 2019. It does talk about sea level rise. So I think at the conceptual level, as I said earlier, it's beginning to come together. But if you go to the grassroots level, I don't think we are really looking at it. So I see putting risk at the center really can help in bringing down those silos around adaptation and disaster risk reduction, or even the new challenge of loss and damage, where we will need to rehabilitate communities if sea level is going to swallow their homes and increase salinity in the farms to a level where farming is not possible anymore. How do we look at the entire spectrum, in kind of one screen, and not divide them into silos, and say, oh, this belongs to DRR and this belongs to adaptation. So, and this can only happen at the local level. And I will say one more thing, Arga, before handing back to you. Another reason I find that challenge remains, or that silo remains from top to bottom, I think we are mixing practice and advocacy. At the international level, and because you talked about global perspective, we will continue to fight for adaptation as a separate stream and separate financing pot for the accounting purposes, because there is an obligation attached to climate finance. And even if we wish to integrate that, we talk about coherence, integration, mainstreaming, that all needs to happen at the local level. But at the international level, we have to count that money, because we are pushing developed countries to foot the bill of adaptation. But that does not mean that we have to continue talking the same lingo right at the local level. I think things should begin to kind of merge at the national level, where we will still see some kind of departmental thinking, which is required to drill down on number of issues. But as we move to subnational and local levels, it should completely dissolve, and that's where the bottom up planning, the local adaptation and resilience strategies are extremely important. Because when we talk about a human being and their lives, you can't break them into several disciplines. For them, it's one life, right? I'm facing a risk. The risk has increased, and I'm facing new risks. So if we have that as a starting point, then we all contribute to that planning process through science, through our previous TRR experience, through our humanitarian experience, which is going to be so valuable for planned relocation, which is going to be a real life situation. It already is, right? People are losing their homes and farms. So who has the experience? Humanitarian community has the experience. It has to scale that. It has to be scaled up. So yeah, sorry for taking a bit of time to respond to the question. I thought I'll just set the context. I would say we need to be very real, very objective, and very pragmatic when we talk about community level engagement. We all know that communities are the first responders to all these risks and challenges. They are the ones who have been dealing with it for generation, for hundreds of years, and they are experiencing those risks firsthand, so they know how risks have increased. So their leadership in planning and implementation is paramount. There should not be any compromise on that count. However, we also need to recognize that there are, I'll refer back to those new risks and challenges and the new signs that has not been sufficiently transferred and disseminated at the local level, which means leaders and community practitioners do not have access to that science, and that gap has to be bridged. So on one hand, we need to recognize their role, and community leaders must tell policymakers and scientists that we need that information. That does not mean that their traditional knowledge is not going to be useful. It is going to be useful, but may not be as useful as it used to be, because when we talk about the new challenges of ocean acidification, right, we don't have a history of dealing with it. We talk about sea level rise at a scale, we don't have a history of dealing with it. But their rights, their informed choices are going to be extremely important when we develop these solutions. So I think community leaders should definitely say, allow us to lead, but at the same time, tell us science in a very, very simple manner, so that it's accessible to us. And of course, they need more resources to deal with the challenge, because the way disasters are increasing, the current level of resources is not going to be sufficient. And I would say we should also invest in new knowledge systems. When we talk about early warning system, early warning we have seen only from disaster perspective, but now from the farming community, you need that information about weather every day in a very simple and accessible manner. So I think it's about looking at new science, but at the same time respecting traditional knowledge and respecting leadership of communities.
Thank you.